Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lifelong learning lecture. We're pleased to have with us Dr. John Huibregtse, Professor Emeritus of History at the Framingham State University. Tonight, he'll be presenting on the Boston Molasses Flood. Before we get started, you were muted upon entry. If you wouldn't mind just staying muted, just so we can avoid any unintended interruptions. And at the end of the chat, John will be taking any questions at the end of the lecture. If you'd like to put your questions into the chat, I'll be moderating those, and I'll read those at the end for John to answer. And now, without further ado, John Huibregtse.
All right, thanks, Sarah. And also thanks, Sarah and folks at the library for all they do, and also Anne Roberti and her team at Framingham State who oversee the lifelong learning series. So big shout out and
Just
thank
leave it
you
on
to them.
one, but it's messing it up.
All right, so
There we go.
the Great Molasses Flood is really a fascinating story. On one level, it's an avoidable disaster that was the result of corporate greed that ended up killing 21 people, injuring about 150, and caused millions of dollars of damage. On another level, as we look at this, we'll see that it's also a microcosm of the social, political, and economic turmoil of the period when it happened, which was 1919. The company that built the tank that
I can
ultimately
hear. That's all. I don't have, as long as I.
the company that built the tank
Yeah.
was called United States Industrial Alcohol Corporation. And they cut corners, they ignored warning signs when they were building the tank, which was built on Boston's North End. I'm trying to get my slides to go forward. And all right, sorry, I'm stuck here. My slides are not moving. Sarah, do you have any idea?
Let's see, do you know what program are you using?
There's a little button over there, like
I'm using the presentation mode on Apple. I have an Apple.
On Apple. And can you advance it by using the arrows on your keypad at all?
No, that's what's not working.
Oh, okay.
That's how I normally do it.
Yeah. If you go back to your overview of the presentation, you might have to just click through each slide as you go along.
Okay. My screen seems completely dead right now. I'm not getting a cursor or anything. Oh.
You might need to reboot and just start all over again.
Okay. I can't even, at this point, I'm not getting a cursor. The escape button is not working.
Oh.
Everything, it just seems to have frozen on me.
You may have to turn off the power.
Okay. I can't, yeah, that's the only way I can get out of it right now. Sarah, can you take off the screen sharing mode?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, okay, Sarah, can you let me try screen sharing again.
Yeah.
Okay, now if I do, okay, that changes the slides, right, folks?
Yeah, that changes the slides, John.
Okay, thank you so much. And sorry about that, folks. Thanks for bearing with us on that. So as I was saying, the flood zone was the tank was built on the north end of Boston, just a couple hundred yards from the harbor. The address was 529 Commercial Street. It's near Kenny Square. and about a 10-minute walk from the current location of the Boston Garden. So the North End, here's a slide of what it looks like today. Looking back, I actually took this photo. My back is facing the harbor, so this is looking basically west from the approximate site where the tank was sitting. So the North End was the original harbor and commercial district of Boston during its early settlement in colonial America. By the 1820s, that was changing. The wealthy had moved out, and the neighborhood had given way to, first of all, Irish immigrants. And later in the 19th century, it became home to a lot of Jewish immigrants who were escaping the anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. And the Jewish immigrants were followed early in the 20th century by a lot of Italian immigrants. So by 1910, the last census taken before the flood disaster, which was in January of 1919, the census showed that there were about 30,000 Italian immigrants living in the North End. It was built in the North End because the neighborhood, as I said, was largely Italian. But more to the point, only about 25% of the Italians were citizens, so they didn't have much political clout because they couldn't vote. Other suitable places were largely working class Irish or other communities of people who were more likely to vote. This was typical of Irish immigrants at
Over
this
here.
time. They tended to be a very insular group, not involved in local politics, unlike Irish immigrants who, as we know, became very involved very quickly upon their immigration. Um, this, what we see happening after the disaster is a pattern of discrimination against Italian immigrants. Anti-immigration rhetoric was very common 105, 6 years ago when this happened. Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge uh, frequently linked immigration to crime, poverty, urban slums, arguing that illiterate immigrants were more likely to become burdens on society than anyone else. President Woodrow Wilson also engaged in racist rhetoric. He said, quote, "We cannot make a homogeneous population out of a group that cannot be blended with Caucasians." He also said that Italian immigrants lacked skill, energy, and the quick intelligence that was necessary in America. So what we're living through today, we see, history does repeat itself, and it's repeating itself a little bit today. In fact, the biggest lynching in American history, something that we almost always associate with African Americans being lynched, but the biggest lynching in American history was in 1891 when 11 Italians were lynched in New Orleans for a crime. Actually, 9 of them had already been acquitted, but they were lynched anyway. So, although the neighborhood was largely Italian residents, during the day it was given over to a lot of Irish American workers. And just looking at the last names of the 21 people who were killed, names like Shaughnessy, O'Brien, Duffy, Noonan, and Callahan, just to name a few, indicate that the neighborhood during the day was still very multicultural, and a lot of Irish immigrants. Because it was the waterfront, they were there working. One of the men killed was a fireman from a fire station right there, and so forth. But at any rate, most of these workers, of course, went home after their workday, and so the residents who lived there were largely Italian American. Molasses was one of the commodities that the original shippers out of New England would have still recognized. Those early wealthy colonialists who lived on Boston's waterfront would have still recognized the molasses in the 20th century. Originally, it was, here's a cartoon to illustrate the anti-immigration. You can see the cartoon was about 1900. You can see the people coming off of the ships all on rat bodies, and some of the things you can read there, the lower right-hand corner, the rat person has a mafia hat on. You see the one right at Wilson's left foot, his hat says socialist. The chute that they're coming out of says the slums of Europe daily. So it gives you a sense of the anti-immigration and the so forth that was present at the time. Well, as I was saying, molasses dated back to early colonial times. It was originally part of the triangle trade that brought slaves out of Africa to the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the sugar would be grown and then brought up and processed in Massachusetts and turned into either molasses, or also rum was another big use of the molasses. This was before people used sugar as commonly as we do. So molasses was a very common form of sweetener that a lot of people used to sweeten their food in some way. By the 19 teens, by World War I, molasses was used to create industrial alcohol, which was important in the manufacture of arms, which of course during World War I was a big export of America. Estimated that the U.S. exported about $1 million a year in explosives and firearms during the war. And so in 1916, when the United States Industrial um, Alcohol Company and its subsidiary, which was based in Cambridge called Purity Distilling, wanted to get in on that money train. So they rushed through the completion of this huge tank on the north end of Boston. It was about 90 feet or about 50 feet high and about 90 feet across. And it was built in the fall of 1917, or excuse me, I misspoke. It was built in the fall of 1915, and so was ready to receive its first major shipment of alcohol in early 1916. Now, molasses is about 40% heavier than water. And so when it was filled, it held about 2.3 million gallons of molasses. And to put that number into a little bit of perspective, not many of us can envision 2.3 million 1 gallon containers of milk, right? The average high school swimming pool has about 180,000 gallons of water in it, an average high school pool. So that means that the tank held just under about 13, or the equivalent of 13 high school pools that were full of water. So that gives you maybe a little bit better perspective on how much molasses was in there. So the person in charge of building the tank was a guy named Arthur Gell. And Arthur Gell was the treasurer of the Purity Distillery Company based out of Cambridge. He had steadily moved up in the company, and he was given charge of building the tank in 1915, and was told, that if you do well on this, you can expect perhaps to get a promotion up to the next level, which would have been a vice presidency at the main company, which was based in New York City. So by the time they found a site, negotiated a lease for the property, they only had about 2 months to get the tank built. And so Gell rushed through the production or the creation of the tank. He told the construction people to put on extra crews to make sure that it got done. And what you see in front of you is the tank itself was 7 curved plates of steel that were held together with rivets and set on a concrete base. The cost of the tank was about $30,000 when it was completed. Now, because the tank was considered a storage facility, it did not need any kind of approval, and that will prove to be deadly later on. It didn't need any kind of approval at all. The base had to be approved because it was concrete and because of the way the laws were written at the time, but the tank itself did not have to have any kind of go through any sort of vetting by anybody who was an expert in these kinds of things. So he cut corners as best he could because he had to get it completed. He was under a lot of pressure. This was the fall of 1915, and the first shipment of molasses from Cuba was set to arrive early in 1916. So once he had the tank completed, logically, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, he should have tested it by filling it with water. He was, after all, right by the harbor. It would have cost something, but he was right by the harbor, so he had lots of water to test it. But he didn't do that. He put 6 inches of water in the tank and said that that was good enough, and it seemed to be fine with 6 inches of water in it. Later on, he said that to fill it completely would have taken too long and cost too much. So that was another corner that was cut in the process. The tanker arrived, unloaded, and almost from the very beginning, the tank leaked. It leaked so much, in fact, that neighborhood kids would come around with buckets or empty containers of some sort to collect the leaking molasses to take home for their families to use. And again, remember, this was before people used so much sugar, so molasses was a much more commonly used sweetener than it is today. And to cover up, and I use the word cover up the leaks very loosely, Gel ordered that the tank be painted brown so that you couldn't see the leaking as readily. And he also had it recaulked a couple of times shortly after its completion, but it still leaked quite a bit. So residents were actually concerned about this. So were some of the people who worked at the tank facility. One of the people who was concerned was a Puerto Rican immigrant, a man named Isaac Gonzalez, who was very concerned about the leaking and the construction of the tank. He admitted that sometimes he would get up in the middle of the night and go there and drain off some of the molasses just to lower the tank a little bit. He also took flecks of it that were rusting off, and without an appointment, he went to Gel's office in Cambridge to try to see Gel and voice his concerns to Gel about what was going on at the tank. And just as sort of parenthetically, a shout out to Gonzalez for, taking time, his own time, to go to see probably his boss's boss's boss with his concern with no appointment, and got kicked out. Gel probably thought he was a crank and ignored him. Later on, Gonzalez resigned. He left and enlisted in the Army during the war. Part of the reason he left was because he was so stressed out about what might happen with the tank. So that tells you something when you enlist in the Army during a war to get away from the stress of your job, when you think being in the Army is going to be less stress than being at a civilian job. So this brings us to the disaster, which occurred on January 15th, 1919. And a couple days before that, early or late on January 12th and into January 13th, a ship arrived in Boston Harbor, and it unloaded about 600,000 gallons of molasses into the tank, which brought the total in the tank at that moment up to about about 2 million gallons. And remember, at the start, I said it held about 2.3 million gallons. So it was pretty close to full. There was only at this point about 9 inches of space between the top of the molasses and the roof of the container facility. Now, if you look at this picture in front of you, you can see at the top of the tank, there's one vent up there, kind of curved over and leaning to the left, or curved over to the left. That was the only vent that was in the tank, or on the tank, I should say, and it was closed because it was winter, and that becomes part of the problem as well. To unload the 600,000 gallons, they had to heat the molasses. As most of you know, molasses is a very thick substance, and of course, when it gets cold, it gets even more solid. And so to ship it, or to pump it off of the tanker, they had to warm it up, and they pumped that molasses into the bottom of the container facility or the container that you see in front of it into the tank. So the colder molasses was on top. And what happened then was that on January 15th, which was a Wednesday, was a day that was unseasonably warm. And that triggered the molasses to begin to ferment, to begin to give off bubbles. And of course, the molasses, the warmer molasses was at the bottom, so that would be fermenting more, but it had that cold layer of molasses of thousands of pounds of cold molasses on top of the warmer molasses. So it starts to ferment more than normal on this unseasonably warm day in January. The superintendent of the site was a guy named William White, and he took advantage of the warm weather. His wife suggested that they go into downtown Boston and walk around and do a little window shopping, which he did. So he was not at the site when it collapsed. Had he been there, it probably wouldn't have made any difference. He did nothing wrong by taking a long lunch hour and doing some window shopping and grabbing lunch with his wife. But in any case, he wasn't there when it collapsed. So about 12:30, it started to break apart. About 12:30 on January 15th. Witnesses said that it sounded like a machine gun being fired as the rivets began to pop, and there was a rumble that people said they felt several blocks away. Fortunately, a Boston police patrolman, a guy named Fred McManus, happened to be on a payphone somewhere very close to here on a routine check-in with his precinct. This was, of course, before they had radios and so forth, so it was a regular call-in situation. And he saw the tank collapse, and so he told the dispatchers to get rescue folks there as soon as possible. Obviously, he knew that this was going to be a disaster. When the molasses let go and it broke out, the wall of molasses that escaped from the tank was about 25 feet high, and it traveled, at least initially, at about 35 miles an hour as it broke out of the tank. And of course, along the way, it picked up debris, which made it even more deadly to get hit by this wall. And molasses is also very heavy. Water is about 8 pounds per gallon. Molasses is around 11 and a half, maybe a little bit less than that. So, something 25 feet high and 35 miles an hour weighing that much is going to have a lot of power, a lot of energy behind it. It swept a number of buildings, including this fire station off of its foundation. That was a firehouse that was very close to the site to the container site. One of the people who died was one of the firemen who was in the station when it was swept off of its foundation. And of course, many of the rescue stories are very, very horrific to read and hard to read. His was particularly hard because he was trapped under something. The molasses was rising. He was talking to some of his colleagues who were nearby, also trapped. And eventually he went quiet as the molasses had raised enough that he was drowned in the flood of molasses that hit the fire station. Another person who lived very close by was a guy named Martin Clordy, and he was asleep. He lived with his mother. He was in his 30s. He was a young man, but he was not a child. He was asleep in his house. He lived with his mother and a sister and a brother. And he was asleep. He actually owned a bar and had been working late the night before and had gotten home and was asleep when the house was swept off of its foundation. He was able to save his his brother and his sister, but his mother was outside, apparently hanging up laundry, doing something outside in the warm weather, and she was one of the people who died in the flood. And unfortunately, the brother whom he saved also died later on from from injuries sustained in the disaster. Stephen, his brother, was disabled. He had mental illness, and he died later that year, and never really recovered from the trauma of losing his mother, his house, and the horror of those things. So those were two of those who were killed. Two others who were killed were two young kids. The two youngest victims of the disaster were two 10-year-olds who were playing or actually they were collecting molasses near the structure just before it blew. A worker came by and shooed them away, but they didn't get far enough away and it collapsed, and they were two of the youngest victims. And in one of the most horrific stories, one of their fathers was watching this happen from their house not far away, and saw the whole thing unfold, and saw their child swept away in all of this. One of the heroes of the disaster was a train conductor named Albert Lehman. And he was an engineer on the elevated railroad, which ran right by the container facility. So as we'll see in a couple of pictures in a minute, that the supports for the railroad were hit very hard by the flood of molasses as it came out. And you can see in this photo how the tracks dipped down. And luckily, the train that Lehman was the conductor on had just passed over this dip just ahead of when the molasses hit. So just seconds ahead of disaster. As soon as he got over, and as soon as he realized what had happened, he stopped the train and he ran back and flagged down and got the train coming behind his to stop, and got trains in the other direction to stop. And luckily, no trains were derailed in all of this. Had an elevated train gone off of something like this, you can imagine how much that would have amplified the disaster, and many more people potentially killed and injured in the process. So Lehman is another of the heroes in this. Another bunch of people who deserve a lot of credit are the sailors on a ship that was anchored not far away in the Boston Harbor, the USS Nantucket. And about 116 sailors saw this all happen. They immediately rushed off of their ship and went charging into the disaster. And they're credited with pulling nearly 24 victims out of the mess, even before the police arrived in full force to start saving people. So there were some heroes in this, and although obviously 21 people killed is horrible, the disaster could have been a lot worse. Rescue workers arrived very quickly to save many more victims from the flood. Some of them, though, succumbed over the next couple of days to injuries. Several of them died of pneumonia from that they got as a result of the accident. A temporary rescue headquarters was set up and established at Haymarket Square, where both the living and the dead were taken to be cared for. And I guess what many of us, if we were first responders, we would think of this, but many of us probably wouldn't. But the dealing with the victims was obviously difficult because of the injuries that they had sustained, but it was also made more difficult because they were all thoroughly soaked from head to foot in molasses. And the molasses would get on the floors, it would make things slippery. You can imagine the problems that dealing with all of this molasses would create for the people dealing with the injured. It was said that molasses was spread throughout the city, even though the wake of the molasses, or the spread of the molasses, stopped after about a mile. But so many rescue workers got it on their boots, on their clothing. They tracked it to their automobiles if they were there, or they tracked it on public transportation, and it got all over Boston. And even some people reported that they saw molasses in Worcester shortly after the disaster. So I don't know if they actually saw it or if they were just seeing dirty stains that they thought maybe were molasses, but they claimed that the molasses was all over Worcester, or got to Worcester. I shouldn't say all over, but at least got to Worcester. So the cleanup was made very difficult because of the nature of just the molasses itself. At the end of the first day, um, the cleanup started almost immediately, as I said. It was January 15th, so the sunset was at about 4:30, quarter to 5 that afternoon. One of the, still doing the very short days of daylight. They didn't have portable generators, enough portable lights, so the rescue efforts came to pretty much a standstill until first light the next morning. But initially, as you can see in the Boston Post headlines here, 11 people were killed and 50 were hurt on that first day. And over the next several days, they were able to recover 10 more people to get to 21 killed in the flood. So the cleanup. Oh, the other thing I should say, I'm sorry, not only were there a lot of people killed and injured, but there were stables nearby and there were a lot of horses that were trapped and had to be euthanized, usually by police officers. Rescue workers and witnesses all talked about the recurrence of gunshots as police officers had to shoot the injured or trapped horses to put them out of their misery. So the Post, you can see the headline in front of you. Let me just read a brief quote from one of the stories that was published in the Post the day after, on January 16th, after the disaster. Quoting, "Molasses was waist deep. It covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form, whether it was an animal or human, being impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess that they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women suffered likewise." So when the efforts to rescue continued the next day, and this photo shows some of the disaster. You can see the elevated train tracks there on the left side of the photo. This next photo also shows the elevated train. You can see some of the debris there. And then the last photo of the disaster. This is actually the tank site itself. And I think the object that you can see in the top of the screen, top of the photo, I should say, I think that's the roof of the container that fell down when it collapsed, but I'm not 100% certain of that. But that's the site where the container stood. So in the morning on January 16th, about 250 rescue workers showed up. Some were from the city of Boston, some were from the Elevated Railroad Company, and some were from the construction company that had laid the foundation for the facility. Neither U.S. Industrial Alcohol nor Purity Distillery, the two companies that owned the tank, sent any help initially. They contended from the very beginning that the tank had been blown up by Italian radicals and that they were not at all responsible for what had happened. And we'll come back and talk about the racist element, the anti-Italian in just a moment, or the anti-Italian rhetoric in just a moment. On the second day, finally, after some heated phone calls back and forth, the company sent about 150 men to help with the cleanup, which was a long and laborious task, cleaning up all of this. You can just imagine, as the molasses solidified, what it was like to clean up. It's estimated that it took about 87,000 man hours to do the cleanup, which took several months of real time. 87,000 hours, just to put that in another kind of perspective for you. If you worked 40 hours a week for about 38 years, you would have worked around 87,000 hours. So that gives you a sense of how long it took. It took several months because there were hundreds and then dozens of people working on the cleanup. As the molasses hardened, chisels and saws had to be used to clean it up. It had to be pumped out of basements, and some of the victims they found were entombed in blocks in their basements. Some of those blocks were just chipped out and then dumped in the harbor. So I'm sure there were, they got out victims, of course, but who knows what kind of other artifacts are now at the bottom of the harbor that got there in these big chunks of molasses that were thrown in there. Eventually, they figured out that seawater worked the best to wash it away, and so luckily they were right by the harbor, and millions of gallons were pumped from the harbor to help clean up the mess that was made. A local judge named Wilford Bolster was assigned to lead an investigation immediately after the disaster. And he filed his report, about a month later, middle of February or so. And in it, he blamed the city for not properly inspecting the tank and for not enforcing the laws that were on the books. And in kind of a classic example of victim blaming, he also blamed the people of Boston for allowing the city to get away with that shoddy enforcement of what rules and lack of some rules. He also concluded that the parent company could be held criminally responsible for the disaster. His report said in part, and I quote, "My conclusion from all this evidence is that this tank was wholly insufficient in point of structural strength to handle its load, insufficient to meet either legal or engineering requirements." And he was absolutely right about that. The case then went to a grand jury. The grand jury, though, ruled that while the company had made some mistakes that ultimately proved disastrous, the mistakes that they made did not rise to the level of criminal negligence, and so refused to hold the company accountable for any of the disaster, any of the hardship that it caused. A year later, 120 civil lawsuits were filed by victims and their families, and this was rolled into one big class action suit. The chief judge of the Boston Municipal Court appointed a lawyer and former military officer, a guy named Hugh Ogden. And there you can see a picture of Ogden there, to arbitrate this case. And the judge told Ogden to block off about 6 months to hear the case. And it took a little longer than that. Ogden did not give out his ruling or hand down his ruling until April of 1925. So it took about 5 years to get through the more than 3,000 witnesses that testified. At the time, it was the largest class action suit in Massachusetts history, and one of the largest in the U.S. history up to that point. The defense's explanation, as I said a few minutes ago, was that it was blown up by Italian anarchists. Purity Distillery had hired Boston police officers earlier before this to patrol the site because of threats, both real and perceived, from the Italian anarchists. In 1916, there was a bomb threat at the USIA facility in Brooklyn, New York. So the fears of anarchists were not unfounded. The company was not unreasonable in taking precautions and worrying about this, because anarchists were indeed a threat. An anarchist had been responsible for William McKinley's assassination 20 some years earlier. Other figures had been assassinated by anarchists. So this fear is not unwarranted, but it's also, in this case, there's zero evidence that the anarchists had anything to do with this, and there never was any evidence that they did. In fact, in early January, a week or two before the disaster, Boston police told business owners along Commercial Street that they suspected there might still be anarchists' activity in the area and that they should take precautions. Gell was concerned, but not enough to hire any more security guards. Again, that wouldn't have made any difference. The crackdown on immigrants was going on in 1919. The leading Italian anarchist, who was based in Boston, a man named Luigi Galliani, who was ultimately deported in June of 1919, was, as I said, deported. And 6 months later, a bomb detonated near the home of the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, which triggered what historians refer to as the Red Scare, sometimes called the Palmer Raids. And in fact, the summer after the disaster is called Red Summer, the summer of 1919, because of the Red Scare and because of all of the violence, a number of race riots in the summer of 1919. The one in Chicago was the biggest of that period. Thousands of Black folks were burned out and beaten out of their homes in Chicago in the summer of 1919. At any rate, the company continued to claim that it was anarchists who had blown up the tank, and again emphasized that there was no evidence of any sort of criminal activity in terms of blowing up the tank. The company's lawyer in the civil case called one eyewitness who lived across the street. She said she had seen smoke shortly before the explosion, but beyond that couldn't offer any specific details. Her behavior on the witness stand was apparently kind of strange and off-putting. One observer said that if the woman was not insane, she was at least very temperamental. So she was not a credible witness, and she was the only witnesses, or the only witness, I should say, that the company produced that to try to back up their bomb theory. Other witnesses near the tank that day said that all they heard were the sounds of the wood and the tank breaking. They said it sounded like thunder. Several witnesses were naval explosive experts stationed on the ships in the harbor, and they also said that there was nothing that made them think it was any kind of explosion, and that sabotage was not the cause for the disaster. The company attorney called a state police officer, an expert in explosives, to testify that he thought it was an explosion. The problem with this expert witness was that this contradicted what he said during his initial interrogation in front of Judge Bolster, who ran the initial investigation right after the disaster. So he just did a 180-degree turn. He said one thing in front of Judge Bolster, and he testified to the opposite during the civil case a couple of years later. There was no evidence of an explosion. There were no broken windows, which would have been typical of an explosion. Some of the buildings that got hit at the lower levels by the Molasses had broken windows. So if it was an explosion, logically, you would think they would have broken windows up above as well, above the line where the Molasses hit, but that wasn't the case. So another piece of evidence that there was not an explosion was that the roof of the container tank fell basically straight down. And had there been an explosion, it probably would have disintegrated in a different way. It would have not have fallen more or less straight down as the molasses flooded out of the tank. So it also came out in the civil proceedings that when Gell testified, that he had no relevant experience or knowledge in building a container like this. He admitted that he did not seek the advice of experts, of engineers, or of anybody who knew anything about this kind of construction of a tank such as this. He did not show the plans to anyone who was qualified to give any kind of opinion about the feasibility of this tank. And you can see on the slide in front of you, ultimately, that he found for the plaintiffs, he fined USIA about $628,000, which today would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million fine. The last slide is just a transcript of Gell's testimony, and where he admits that he didn't have anybody who knew what they were doing looking at the plans before it was built. So the other damning thing that came out during the civil testimony that points to Gell's incompetence and his culpability in this, they established that the steel plates were about 10% thinner than the plans called for. And the company's attorney tried to argue that that was normal, that when you ordered something like that, it never came back to the exact specs that you ordered it to. And more modern, this didn't come out in the trial, but more modern experts have looked at it and speculate that the plates were probably about half as thick as they should have been for the tank and to hold that kind of weight. The last thing to come out in the civil proceedings that point towards the culpability of the company is engineers testified that there was a lot of what's called in engineering drift when the tank was being built. And what that means in this context is that the holes for the rivets didn't line up exactly. So what they would do then is put some sort of steel bar into the two holes and then hit the bar until the two holes lined up and then put the rivets in. So, think about buttoning a shirt and your shirt buttons don't exactly line up and you move them around so that it lines up a little bit and you can button your shirt. Kind of the same thing, but and a little bit of drift is normal in this kind of construction, but engineers testified that this drift was more than normal and that by doing the process of getting the holes to line up so that they could insert the rivets, that weakened the metal, and that metal fatigue was the likely cause of the ultimate collapse. That during construction, these rivet holes were fatigued because they didn't line up, and through the process of being filled up, being emptied, going through hot summers, cold winters, that just caused the metal fatigue to expand and get worse, and that ultimately led to the collapse of the tank when it was filled with all that molasses. So the $628,000, as I said, about $11 million today, maybe a little bit more than 11 million. Not a lot of money by today's standards. If a disaster like this occurred, you could see the payout being far, far bigger. But in the context of this time period, that was a lot of money and a lot of damages to be paid out by a company. It really was kind of a landmark decision in favor of victims of corporate negligence. Just one example on kind of the other end of the spectrum. In 1911, there was a major fire in New York City called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that some of you may have heard of. This horrible fire killed 146 people right in downtown New York, very close to NYU, off of Washington Square Park is where the Triangle factory was. And the owners of the Triangle factory, who were as negligent or more so than the USIA folks, had to pay about $75 to each victim was all that they had to pay, which comes out to around $10,000 or $11,000, not a very big sum of money. And ironically, they also had insurance, and so ultimately they made money on the fire, even though they had to pay out about $50,000 to victims. So that's kind of an example on the other end of the spectrum of a horrible disaster where the corporate owners were not held accountable at all. So this story, like a lot of stories in history, is told because of corporate greed and disregard for public safety. As a result of the disaster in Boston, building codes were more strictly enforced. New regulations were enacted to address some of the clear shortcomings of the building process. More supervision of construction, including having a certified engineer approve all plans before they could be, before a building or a structure of any kind could be built, resulted in this. The collapse was inevitable, it seems, with all the mistakes. And if there is any kind of silver lining in this, and that's a stretch, I understand, but it's lucky that this did not happen in the summer because there is a park very close to this collapse site. I'll put that first map back up. You can see where it says beach there. On the right side of the screen there on that left photo. And there are other recreational facilities close by that likely would have been filled with kids and families, and who knows who else would have been there had it been summer. And the other thing that made it fortunate that it was in winter and not in the summer is think of the insects and rodents that this would have attracted had it first in July or August at the height of summer, and all of the disease and other hardships that all of those pests would have brought into the city of Boston and exacerbated the disaster and no doubt made it even worse. So that wraps up my presentation. Thank you. I would mention also that I used a book called The Dark Tide, written by an author named Stephen Puleo, Puleo. The book is called Dark Tide. So if anybody is interested and wants to learn more about this in greater detail, that would be the book that I would recommend you go down to your library and check out. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah and any questions that folks might have.
Thank you very much. That is absolutely fascinating to me. John, I was just curious myself too. When you mentioned Italian anarchists, I was thinking about Sacco and Vanzetti.
Yes.
Was that around the same time?
Yes, it was. Sacco and Vanzetti, I'm blanking. I think it was 1920. It was about a year after this that that the crime was committed that Sacco and Vanzetti were ultimately executed for.
Mm.
It was either 20 or 21. I'm just blanking on the date, but it was pretty much in terms of history, it was at the same historical moment. And yeah, they were caught up in um, the same racism, the same anti-Italian rhetoric caught them up as well. And they may or may not have been guilty, but their guilt or innocence aside, the trial that they had was an absolute travesty, regardless of their guilt or innocence.
Mm. Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting to kind of like pinpoint that moment in time where there was this, distrust of anarchists, communists, any kind of like, immigrant coming in. So
Yeah,
just kind
yeah,
of
and,
popped into my head.
the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was going on at the same time. There were attempted revolutions in Germany. I mean, this is just the exact aftermath of World War I, which ended in um, November of 1918, and that was the milieu that created the Nazi Party and ultimately led to Adolf Hitler coming to power.
Wow. So I do have a few questions in the chat, and I'd like to invite anyone now. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and I can read them off for John to answer. So we do have one person. How did you get interested in this subject?
Good question. I give, well, I didn't grow up in Massachusetts. I didn't grow up in New England. And so, to be honest, I don't know that I ever heard of the Boston Molasses flood until I moved to Massachusetts in 1997. And it's just I first heard about it, and it's almost like it sounds like it's something should be amusing and funny, and obviously it's anything but amusing and funny. So that was what triggered my initial interest in it, and it was something that I would always bring up in class. Never went never went into it in as much detail as I did tonight, but it's an important piece of local history, and it's really good to use in the classroom because it captures that moment of fear of radicalism and of the Red Scare and some of the other things that were going on in 1919, 1920. So, like a lot of things when I was teaching, it's a good story to get us into a particular era, a particular set of circumstances that this helps to explain and illustrate, and something that's local. It's students in Massachusetts would much rather hear about this than about something that happened in San Francisco, and I'm sure the students in San Francisco would much rather hear about San Francisco than Boston.
Mhm. I have another question. This one's from Mary. Is there a marker on the site that you know of, on the site of the tank, or anything that explains the disaster? Is there a marker there?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and it's about a paragraph, and it just gives the barest of details.
Let's see. I have a couple technical questions people are interested in. What was the cause of death? Did people drown in molasses, or did they get asphyxiated?
Both, and a number of people died of injuries afterwards as well. Quite a few people developed pneumonia and died. Of the 21 who died, and I am obviously not a medical person, but I'm assuming that those that died of pneumonia asphyxia or inhaled a lot of molasses and their lungs just couldn't fight it off, and that led to the pneumonia that killed them. So yeah, and some people were crushed in the flood that hit them. So it was a pretty gruesome scene.
Mhm. We have another person who's looks like they're curious about more primary source documents or looking into this more. I know that you mentioned one book. Are there any more sources that people could take a look at?
Yeah, there's a website associated with the Boston Public Library that I used as well. And I'm going to disappear off of my screen for 1 second. Just bear with me, please. Um, as I was talking, I was throwing pieces of paper on the floor with my notes on them, and I needed to pick it up so I could see what I wanted to mention. But yeah, it's Research Guides, Boston Disasters Home, and that's on the BPL Boston, or the BPL website, and I got material from that as well.
Mhm.
And there's also been a lot of the photos that I use in the presentation. I got off of watching YouTube videos about the disaster, and I'd get the photos just by freeze framing and getting that. But there's several pretty good YouTube explanations of the disaster as well.
Mhm.
And
And I'm just curious for myself as far as primary documents. I believe at the beginning of your talk you mentioned that there were testimonies. Were those written, or do you know if there's any oral histories that people could listen to?
I don't know about oral history specifically. I would guess and say yes if you want to track them down. And I didn't use any of those, but yeah, they're court records as well, and that's where this came from. I'm not sure where I found this anymore, but the court records would be primary sources that would be available as well.
Mhm. Well, I want to thank you, John, very much for being here. This was a fantastic topic. I know folks really enjoyed it. So thank you again for coming. And thank you very much for everyone who came to this talk. We'd love to see you next time. And I hope everyone has a good night.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate taking time to come to the talk.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well
Thanks.
done.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
John.
You're welcome.